This session is about living on the Kenai Peninsula. I have an announcement also. If you look at the program, one of our speakers unfortunately was not able to come. So Josh Wisniewski, to talk about fish aren't money, that is not happening. But we'll move on. And our first speaker this afternoon is Adam Dunstan. And he's speaking on exploring the relationship between salmon and the Nutana Dena'ina communities in the 19th century, a cultural keystone species approach. And Adam is an anthropology professor here at Kenai Peninsula College. He researches indigenous knowledge, environmental policy, and the anthropology of religion, among other topics. So turning it over to Adam.
Well, before starting, I have a few acknowledgements that I would like to give. The first of which is that we are on Nutana Dena'ina land, and that is an important part, of course, of what we'll be talking about today. Something we cannot understand understanding that, of course. I also wanted to acknowledge the Kenai Indian tribe who I've collaborated with on this project that I'll be talking about today. And in fact, they were the ones that invited me on, so I'm so grateful to them and to the members of their research review board who approved this paper. I also wanted to acknowledge my research technician, Nick Jasek, who's worked on this project with me, as well as my former research technician, Jasmine Koster, who also worked on this project with me. Now, this is a story about the Kenai River and about the people and salmon bound together with it over the centuries. However, although it's about Kenai River, I'd actually like to start with a story from Tyonek, a story from Nikifor Alexin, who in 1965, in How Tyonek People Used to Eat, talked about a young girl who saw the salmon swimming in the river and wanted to see what they saw and be like them. And so she was transported into the river and swam up to where they go after they die. And she saw that the salmon report back after they die about how they were treated by the fishers who caught them, whether they were treated nicely or poorly, and that helps determine whether or not they return. I start this paper with that story because I want to think about salmon today in the Kenai River not as a natural resource, but instead as social entities, as people bound up in relationships with other human people. The human people I'll be discussing, of course, are the Nutana Dena'ina, by which I mean Dena'ina communities of the Kenai River region. Especially, I'll be focusing on the 1800s, and the reason I'm focusing on that is because I was using a lot of archival materials, and the earliest sources I had available to me in terms of historical resources and explorers' accounts and different things were from the early 1800s, and as well because I was drawing on a lot of stories from Dena'ina elders, which trace back to kind of the late to mid 1800s. So that's why I was focusing on that time period. However, as I think will be very obvious, the practices and beliefs that we're talking about today about salmon, I think will be very clear are things that predate, of course, European arrival. And so really what I'm trying to talk about here, however imperfectly, is about traditional Nutana culture in relation to salmon. The time of the campfire people, as Peter Kalfornsky puts it. Now, if we can go to the next one. Thank you so much. I'll be drawing on a variety of already published historic and ethnographic materials that I did research with from the Alan Boris collection in our anthropology lab here at KPC. Dozens of sources were used, everything from early Russian priest accounts to the Siri-produced book, Our Stories, Our Lives, to the linguistic works of Jim Carey and Gerard Smith, who we'll be talking later. However, it will be evident as I talk that I lean heavily on Peter Kalfornsky's writings for obvious reasons, and that I also lean heavily on Cornelius Osgood's ethnography of the Dena'ina, as deeply problematic as it is, and I recognize that it is still one of our earliest ethnographic accounts, and so it has some useful information. Now, in thinking about the relationship historically between salmon populations and Nutana, there's a lot of different ways we could phrase that and think about that, and I don't think the term is as important as recognizing the importance. However, the term or concept that I've been using, partly because it was part of a grant that I wrote in collaboration with the tribe, is something called cultural keystone species. And cultural keystone species is a concept that was first proposed in 2004 by Garibaldi and Turner. And it's the idea that although all species in an environment may be important to a group of people, some species, quote, shape in a major way the cultural identity of a people as reflected in the fundamental role these species have. And they say that without cultural keystone species, the societies they support would be completely different. So, very similar to like a keystone in an arch, if you've ever seen one of these before, right? If you were to remove the keystone, it messes up the weight distribution, the arch falls apart. The idea of a cultural keystone species is that the society would be completely different if not for that species. And by the way, since I'm using that term, I did want to clarify that I'm not an idiot. I recognize that salmon are in fact 5 species and not 1 species. However, for my purposes, we'll be treating them as a cultural keystone species so that I don't have to do the awkward wording of, let me tell you about these 5 cultural keystone species every time that I talk. So I now want to, before I get into that kind of theoretical academic mumbo jumbo though, I wanted to start with something that Peter Kalporsky says, which is, it's clear in Dena'ina that every plant, insect, living creature has a life of its own. That's their belief. And that's echoed in the story by Proteonic that I shared. It's also echoed in the historic common practice of disposing of salmon bones by returning them to the water. So I want to kind of acknowledge that more relational, indigenous foundation before we kind of get into this theoretical model. But with this model, basically the idea of a cultural keystone species, this is a graph I did. The typing is so small that you can't really see what I put on there, and I apologize for that. But basically with cultural keystone species, that theory, there's sort of 7 different, 6 to 7, depending how you count, different characteristics of like what makes something a cultural keystone species. And so what I'd like to show is just how heavily salmon fit as a cultural keystone species historically. And of course, we all know this, right? We all know that salmon are fundamentally important to Dena'ina societies historically. This is just one more way of sort of parsing that and of sort of bringing together some historic materials to just kind of further spell out what we mean by that. Next slide. So the first thing here, a characteristic of cultural keystone species generally is that they are used routinely and in large quantities, as the early scholars kind of developed this idea. And that's very obviously the case for Kenai River Dena'ina communities. That should shock no one in the audience. However, it is worth noting just how central and intensive the usage of salmon was in the 1800s, and how universally that was recognized by early writers. So for example, G.I. Davidoff, writing in 1807, remarks, the main part of the Kenai diet is made up of fish. A century later, Frederick Cook's exploratory account to the top of the continent characterized Dena'ina people as primarily salmon fishers. And Osgood, interestingly, says that salmon is the most important article of diet along with fish. And then he said something that I thought was really interesting after. He says, Kenai Dena'ina people insist on this point especially, bringing as collaboration stories of hunger periods in the early spring when there are no fish. So sort of this idea in a lot of the early literature of like salmon in general, incredibly important, and then even perhaps more so in Kenai River area where it's so central to kind of what people were doing as far as their village life, but obviously important in all areas. One other thing that I wanted to mention with that is that a lot of, well, actually, I won't go there for time. So can we go to the next slide? Second characteristic of cultural keystone species is the idea that to be a keystone species, a species has multiple uses. So when I started this research, I expected there to be, a couple of different uses, mainly just the fact that it's food, obviously, for people. And that is true. I was shocked, though, to see just how many roles salmon historically have played in Kamehameha life and broader Dena'ina society. So I'm going to note several. Most of these would apply to other Dena'ina groups specifically, even though my focus was mainly on Kenai River. So the first one has to do with babies. So salmon were key life givers at both the start and end of 18th century Kamehameha lives. As babies, several sources report that mothers would wean their kids using the soft and protein-rich flesh of salmon when it was time for them to start eating more solid foods. And then conversely, at the end of life, Osgood notes that in addition to sort of a one-day meal, that the elders would also eat a breakfast of boiled dried fish. So salmon providing sort of extra sustenance for elders so that they continue to survive and thrive and share their wisdom with younger generations. So transitional food is sort of both the start and end of life. But in addition to being food, which I think is where we always go, there's also kind of what I found in a lot of the research was the way in which salmon were an important link to other kinds of food networks. And I want to explain what I mean by that. So in this picture, you see kind of a basic diagram of a traditional method of harvesting halibut. But what you would sometimes have in some of the records is the idea that people would use like humpback salmon, usually about 14-inch, 16-inch long, and then attach it to a pole like that and use that as the bait to catch halibut. And then in addition to that, rotten fish as well as fish eggs would be used as bait for lynx traps, as well as fox deadfall traps to provide for fur as well as food for people. And so it's not just sort of salmon as food themselves, but salmon is sort of part of this bigger web of how you obtain a lot of the other kinds of foods that you use. Fish also sustained hunters while they obtained land animals for food that they were hunting in the autumn and winter. Californsky writes that the Kenai Dena'ina, quote, hunting was no problem for them. Everyone carried their own food supply, dried meat, dried fish, roe, seal oil. And that's something that other sources corroborate as well. In addition to sustaining human hunters, though, salmon sustained another important part of sort of the Katnut Ana hunting assemblage, which was hunting dogs, or rather I should say dogs that also hunted. We might think of sort of a hunting triad that consisted of humans, dogs, and salmon. And I want to credit my research technician, Jasmine Koster, for sort of pointing me in this direction and for working with me on developing this point. Basically, kind of the idea here is dogs, of course, were historically used for hunting, helping to find beaver holes, helping to find locating bears, as well as just in general, like baying certain kinds of prey species. But those dogs were very often fed fish, a practice that persisted not just in traditional times, but well into the 20th century. For example, L.C. Sanders Cresswell, who was born in 1927 in Kenai, says, we put up fishing racks for the dogs. We dried the fish in the summertime, then we bundled them up, and then we put them in the attic for winter for the dogs' food. When we were hunting, they took the dog team. So then salmon become this way of sort of sustaining this incredibly important hunting partner of dogs. By the way, purely coincidental, but the name for dog and salmon in Dena'ina, if you're not aware of this, is like very, very similar. At least, so king salmon is like and then dog is folk. I'm looking at my Dena'ina professor, like, am I saying that right, or did I get that mixed up? Because I always get that mixed up. But yeah, that's just pure coincidence. But I thought that was interesting. Fish, presumably salmon, also played an important link in obtaining safe passage and blessing during hunting in the mountains. One early linguist, Radloff, talks about Katnut Ana people sharing with him that when they would go hunting in the mountains, in order to ensure success, they would bring offerings, and that would include, among other things, baked fish and dried fish eggs, which would be put into fire with the understanding and the hope that that would help ensure that they were sort of received as guests in sort of the distinct land that mountains are. So there's other elements as well, things that I don't have as much data for, which like some of the records will briefly mention, but which we don't have enough to really say definitively. For example, one talks about fish skin sacks being used to help carry people's ceremonial items after they've passed away. Another one talks about salmon skin parkas. But that's kind of what I wanted to say about multiple uses. So if we could go to the next slide, thank you. A third characteristic of a cultural keystone species is typically that it will be reflected in the quote naming and terminology in a language, including seasonal indicators, names of months or seasons, place names, specialized vocabulary. In Dena'ina Kanaga, the people's language, salmon are not just reflected, but they swim through the river of the language, jumping through the surface regularly. So for example, with month names, Dena'ina month names varied somewhat historically across different communities, but especially when you're looking at like outer inlet dialect, a lot of the month names specifically have to do with salmon. So for example, so it is May, which means like king salmon month, obviously, because that's when the king salmons are starting to run. June translates into salmon month. July, which makes sense, of course, because you have sort of red salmon, dog salmon, and king salmon at the same time. And then July translates into humpback salmon month, humpback salmon month, or also into fish run month as another phrase. So you see over and over again how kind of ecological knowledge is embodied in the language, because what they're calling fish run month here, that's obviously the month where like all 5 species are running, right? So it's not just fish run month, it's like the most fish run month. Taxonomically speaking, in Dena'ina, which is the root word for king salmon, is also used as sort of a generic term for fish, which draws on kind of a bigger pattern in Dena'ina language, where, for example, one animal will stand in for a broader class of animals, like like chickadee, will stand in for birds occasionally. So, for example, in Peter Californsky's writings, when he uses the term sometimes he'll translate that into English as salmon, and sometimes just as fish, and he wants to sort of generically say like somebody was eating fish. So that kind of shows how central salmon were, that they sort of become this like prototype for other species of fish. And then finally, place names, which I'm a little bit nervous to talk about because we've got a couple of experts in the audience, but in any case, when you look at Shem Pete's Alaska, for example, one of the things you notice is that when you, each like region, which is helpfully put as a chapter, each region of place names, between 10 to 30% of the place names have to do with fishing or fishing activity. Not shockingly, higher percentages the closer you are to a strong salmon run. What is surprisingly is that a lot of outer inlet names that we have, for example, in the just amazing Dene place names atlas that will be talked about later, a lot of those names don't explicitly mention salmon, which seems really contradictory. You're on one of the best salmon runs in the world. Why would that not be like a key part of many of your place names? Nick and I have tossed that around a lot, and one of the things he suggested is that perhaps place names often have information about the shape of the land, which they do, which would suggest fishing activity without overtly stating it. I've also wondered if part of it is that just that fishing was so abundant on the Kenai River that it sort of went without saying, and it was not a useful thing to point out to distinguish a place. The exception sort of proving the rule. But even still, there are a variety of Dena'ina place names in this area that talk about fish. So for example, in California, where I trapped Shante Summer Fish Run Place, Yurta for a fish trap site in Starsky Creek, many other names. Next slide. The fourth characteristic of cultural keystone species is that it will be reflected in ceremonies, dances, songs, and crests. I'll kind of touch briefly on this. One of the things is clan names. Peter Kalifornsky, as well as several other like early explorers, talk about different clan names, and they're organized slightly different depending on the different who's writing it. But consistently there's Kali'i, which translates essentially into Fishtail Clan and relates to a story about three sisters who helped found the clans, and one of them came across a salmon tail on the beach. There's also a variety of stories about salmon. Interestingly, a lot of them correlate in some way with birds. So for example, there's a story about golden crowned sparrow that Peter Kalifornsky tells, where people didn't know when the salmon would come and they were worried, and then golden crowned sparrow lets out a specific call, and then people realize that golden crowned sparrow will let them know when peak salmon are starting to run. So there's actually several stories like that. There's also several raven stories that relate to salmon. For example, in a story where Raven gives some of the earliest songs to people, it also involves Raven sort of having to hide the fact that he was eating a decomposing salmon. So things like that. And then ceremonies, I don't consider it my place to talk about that, other than to mention one thing that's been widely published, including by people like Shempi and Peter Kalifornsky, which is the idea of like a first salmon ceremony, and the idea, as Elsie Cresswell put it, that when somebody gets a first king, everybody in town receives some, and that it's also a time of sort of marking and giving thanks. The next slide. Finally, well, not finally, second to finally, a characteristic of cultural keystone species is that they persist often, even amidst major culture change. That's obviously true today, and that's a big part of what we're doing interviews about. However, I want to point out that even back in the early 20th century, you have people saying things like, we put up all our salmon during the summer, and then wintertime, my dad would go out and get a moose. So yes, canneries had come in. Yes, there had been devastating impacts of a variety of sources, but the seasonal cycle of sort of salmon and hunting continued to be a key part of people's lives. Next slide. And then finally, the final kind of characteristic that we use to talk about a keystone species is irreplaceability. And it would be difficult to overstate how irreplaceable salmon are in traditional Haudenosaunee communities. In terms partly of spatiality, so archaeologically speaking, we find most of the large Dena'ina settlements in this area immediately adjacent to strong salmon runs. For example, we're located here at KPC on what used to be Slycott Creek Village, which was, as far as we can tell, abandoned in 1600, but it would be difficult to say. But in any case, there are like 70 cache pits on the hook, some of which have salmon in them, and then a variety of home sites near Chile. Which brings up a second point, which is that not only do salmon kind of affect where people put their villages, but it also, in this case, they're sort of summer villages, but it also allowed people to have more permanent villages, more home bases, where they would sort of have something that was occupied for huge chunks of the year, but then be going off to fish camp or hunting. In part because salmon were stored in these elfn and tog, which are absolutely brilliant. Among other things, they have sphagnum moss, which is antimicrobial, so it keeps things like clean there. But anyways, these were essentially a deep freeze that didn't have to use electricity or fossil fuels, right? That allowed for freezing of salmon under the ground. And then that tied in with the leadership system where the Geshka, the wealthy man or chief as it was sometimes translated, would redistribute salmon that they put up all summer during the winter. So obviously they were hunting and things and gathering, but this was sort of a backup food supply throughout the entire winter. And indeed, part of the way the Geshka showed that they were a reliable provider is partly by making sure that everybody got a reliable supply of salmon during the winter. Final slide. And then, finally, people talk about also trade as a big part of cultural keystone species characteristic. And just briefly, I'll mention, that in trading with Koniak, Supiak people, and also with other Dena'ina villages, dried fish was sometimes kind of like a going away food that would be given as sort of like, as you're on your way back to Kodiak Island, here's some fish, even though the main thing we were trading, was for whale meat. So in conclusion, I want to close with a quote, actually from Carla Wick, who I don't think I see in the audience, but if so, Carla, I'm going to be quoting you. A leader from Savantoth Native Association. He said something at opening at the net a few months ago. He said, without the fish, the tribe wouldn't be what it is today. Through the fish, we're a family. So salmon then, again, not simply as a food source, not simply as a natural resource, but as truly constitutive of peoplehood and culture. Truly, salmon are life. So thank you very much for listening.
We have time for a few questions. Anybody have a question for Adam before he speaks away?
Apologies.
Okay, so have you ever for mapping out the settlements and everything? Have you ever thought of using ArcGIS to either map out like the shell position of each yield to map out your settlements for fishing?
We have thought about that, and I and myself, my skills in GIS are extremely rusty, so but there's somebody up in Anchorage, Norm Van Dalen, who is in our anthropology department, and he and I have talked about possibly doing that.
Anybody else here have questions?
How did this relationship, or did it change your view of salmon and or how did this research change your relationship with salmon and place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Since I got here, my view of what it means to eat and what it means to live on a piece of land have changed really dramatically as far as feeling much more accountable. But specifically with the research, something that it has kind of reinforced for me and just further went deeper with is the idea to stop thinking of this as sort of like food stocks or something like that, right? Or salmon runs or things like that, the way that I was sort of trained back when I was doing environmental sciences, my career path, and truly just recognizing this is like a relationship of society, right? That truly you cannot think of Dena'ina society in this time period without thinking of salmon as part of that, and that that's a reciprocal relationship, and that if we don't show respect, that relationship breaks apart. So thanks, Ben, that's a really good question.
What is the value of salmon eggs in the Dena'ina culture? I was surprised to hear you say they were used for bait for other animals. Were they cherished? Were they consumed, or is it sort of something people got rid of?
Salmon eggs were also consumed by people as well, but they just, as I understand it, I'm no expert on lynx biology, but lynx seem to particularly like them, so they were also very good bait for lynx. Great question, thank you. I will say on that note that far more parts of salmon were traditionally eaten than most people eat today, and that's certainly including fish eggs.
Any questions online?
All right, thank you so much, everyone.
Keeping with the salmon theme, our next speaker is John Ross, and I will stick to the English part of this. The title in the English part is Cook Inlet Dena'ina Territory, from when things have been happening to the people. And John is a longtime resident of the Cook Inlet drainage and has done extensive work, and I will let him introduce himself. Take it away, John.
Okay. Hello, I'm John Ross Shaiji, Nation Dena'ina Shaiji Thilan. Yali Jani na Akilanda, Yalas Kunai Tatu. Kakikea Kea Shikechko. Should sit sat na Yagan and Hitana Gaila. Some Dena'ina greetings for you. I said that I'm from Kenai. My Dena'ina name is Anushin. Said my ancestors are the Yagan and Hitana, the cooking for the Kenai Peninsula people. And my title is Tikatnin Tana Ethnena Kabethnin Kultses. And Tikatnu is our name for Cook Inlet. Means big water river. Takana is the name for a people of a place. So the Cook Inlet people. Eshnen is our word for land, Eshnen. And Kabethnen Kultses means from when things have been happening to the people. And I'll get into that word a little bit later. I just want to acknowledge that this is the Denina land, Denina Eshnen Agini D. Tikak Nutana Eshnen Agini D. This is the traditional homeland of the Within the Denina. Denina Eshnen Yashdu Chapro Betno. I live and work on the land of the Denina. I guess you could switch. So Sheshnei, that means my maternal relatives. And I want to just tell you a little bit about my maternal relatives. Before I do that, my paternal relative is right here. Alan Ross. I don't see my mom right here. But my paternal relatives, Linda Ross is my mom's name. Her parents are Harry and Julia Mann. They passed. Her sisters, Harriet, Eleanor, Patricia, Bernice. Harriet's passed away. Some of you might have known her. She's been in this community for many years. Unfortunately, impacted from COVID-19. My aunt, Patricia Mann, she passed last year too. And I still have some of my aunties, and I just want to say that my family here, the Kenai people and the Salamata people have been taking care of this place for about 1,000 years. And we are one of the only Athabascan tribes that live on the ocean. So 1972 was an important year. That was the birth of our written language. Jim Carey, I think there he is. He was involved in the birth of this alphabet for our language. Michael Kraus was involved with that, and Peter Kalifornsky, one of our elders, was one of the first to learn this alphabet. It was also a good year because that's the year I was born. And prior to that alphabet, there was no real written language for Denai. It was taken from an only oral language and brought into a written language. There were a few other speakers back at that time with Peter, Bertha Munfer, Padasha Sakaloff, we came back to it. Also, my grandmother, Mary Askalkoff, was alive at that time. She passed in 1985. And thank you, Jim, for interviewing her. I have a beautiful recording of her speaking in Denina for 30 or 40 minutes and telling different stories. She tells a story about how the ravens stole the sun, moon, and stars, and a bear story. She talks about a potlatch in Tyona, getting fish up at Stepankas, her dad going across the inlet in skin boat to Holly Creek, different things like that. So these are my maternal relatives, and we're part of the Kenai tribe, the Salamatoff tribe. And we have clans. That's the maternal part of it. We have traditions, and we're really going through a process of rediscovery, process of reclamation, and of restoration. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of work when you've lost a lot to bring things back, but we are in that process. Go ahead, I'll see what else we got here. Colonization, industrialization, global conflict. these are definitely, things that have impacted, the people here. I want to give kind of a couple snapshots, so I have a couple different things to read to you. The first one is something that was published in 1885. And I don't know exactly where I found this or how I came across it, but I think it was a San Antonio newspaper. Maybe some of you have seen or heard of this before. But this was someone who was working for the government and spent 6 years in Alaska. I assume he spent a majority or a good part of that in Kenai. And I'll just pick and choose a couple things here and summarize this. Says, I haven't, and he's writing in 1885, I haven't been in Alaska since 1876, said a former government employee who was stationed in that country for several years. But from all I can hear, the occupation of the land by increasing numbers of white people has not had the effect of changing the customs of the country. In some portions of it, at least, to any great extent. The Indians still believe in evil spirits that inhabit the water, hold their slaves secretly, practice polygamy, and retain all their social and religious forms and ceremonies. They have their sorcerers, repudiate all relationship on the father's side, and live generally as they did under the rule of the Russians. It talks about marriage and provides an example of how that happened back then. Talks about a mother and a child and how that caring relationship was like. Talks about how the people took care of the old and disabled and orphans. And then he tells a little bit of a story of something that happened to him on one day. 3 things. In one day's trip, I was treated to 3 of the rarest sights I ever saw. One of these was the watching from behind a rock of a family of beavers at work felling timber and building dams. I say a family, but there must have been 200 of them, everyone working away like mad. I was guided by a Kenai Indian, and before we reached the lake where I saw the beavers, I was puzzled at the crashing of timbers to the ground, as if some great whirlwind were at play among the trees. I could hardly believe the Indian when he said the trees were being felled by beavers. When we came in sight of the lake and the hills about it, I no longer doubted. Scores of the busy animals were gnawing down the trees. Others were trimming the branches off as neatly as could have been done with an axe. Others were chopping the timber into the proper lengths for use. Others rolled the pieces into the water and floated them to the dam workers, who were rapidly laying up a wooden structure of which the most expert of human workmen might well have been proud. I watched the beavers at work for an hour and then left the spot reluctantly. That night, by the way, I had beaver meat for supper, went to bed on beaver skin and covered myself with beaver furs, and had beaver again for breakfast. I had never eaten beaver meat before, and I found it was good. My guide told me that the lake where we had seen the beavers was one of a chain of 7, and that it was the great Indian trapping place. They trapped in one lake one year and in another the next, and so on, thus giving the beavers an opportunity to increase in the waters which were not disturbed. One of the other curious sights I saw that day was a grizzly bear fishing for salmon. His feet measured 16 inches across and were nearly twice as long. He ended up shooting that bear with the help of a guide he had there. The third strange sight I saw that day was toward evening. It was summer and we came to the mouth of a mountain torrent near where we were to camp. We stopped by the shore of the stream. A herd of reindeer, at least 20 of them, came out to drink. They were not 30 feet from us, and raised their great antlers and stood looking at us with such apparent confidence in our good intentions that I would not permit the guide to abuse it, as he was on the point of doing. Those were what I wanted to read from that. This was 100 years after the Russians had come to Kenai, which originally was 1786 when the first fort was built at Sila, about not even a mile from my house. 1786. A few years later, 1791, another fort was built at Kenai here. Both of these groups of people working for the Russian company, Navita Vostochin, same company, but they were fighting with each other. Then you had also another company, Shelikov Company. Over the years, they were fighting with that company as well. And what happened was in 1797, our people here were pretty much fed up with what was going on. All the conflict between these companies, our people getting caught in between that, especially our women. And so we resisted and we rebelled. And there was a battle of Kenai in 1797. And all of the Russians who were here at the time died, including 100 of our own Dena'ina people. And what I read to you, probably you wouldn't have heard that if that didn't happen, if that rebellion didn't happen. Things would have been a lot different. Maybe we would have had a writing system in the early 1800s, like many of other places, like the Aleuts. I'm not sure. But that same year, there was massacres also at Tyonak and at Iliamna. And the Russians, after that time period, they ended the competition between companies. They created the monopoly in 1797 or 99, the Russian American company, and they began to shift their operations to Sitka. Next slide. So I want to talk just a little bit about Peter Kalifornsky, and Jim Carey is featured in this picture as well. This picture is from a book that came out, I believe, in 1978 on explorations in Alaska. And what I would like to do is to just read you that quote from that picture and what was underneath that picture. Because it comes from Peter Kalifornsky, and he's talking about what are the effects of exploration and colonization and that kind of thing on people in Kenai. The effects of exploration on native culture in Alaska since the time of Christopher Columbus came. And you go along to every change, the Russians' time, the gold rush times, and the Union time, and the war, and every addition has been handed down to the Alaska Natives. They have been affected. The Alaska Natives been affected with all this additional. The Denainas had a way of life for their health until the whites come. And all these years, these histories been written, been told as positive. It's bad and good on both sides. It had to be done one way or another in order to make a go of it some way. And now a fact of that exploration on native cultures in Alaska was way of life, the way they live, the way they know how to live for their health. And that's all been affected, and their country been affected. As you go along until the last war, and after that, our statehood, land claims, and all this benefacted to the people. Now, this younger generation, if they had to go and survive, to go back to the native way of life, the way it was, they cannot make it. Now, none of us can make it because the country has been ruined by the people. And the game and country has been ruined. I say this because, like this Kenai Peninsula here, I can see it myself. It's been destroyed for game. It's all torn up. In my country, trap line up there, they have the oil lines up in there now. Now, if you had to go back there and survive through that country, you can't make it. For the game is gone, fishing, everything. The way of natives' life been taken away from them by the law. Look, we understand this, that this all had to be done, and you can't say it's good. It's good and bad on both sides. You can't leave the country alone without any protection. So that's what we stand for now. That's my opinion. Thank you. It kind of shows the contrast of even 100 years after the Russians, you know, how our people were interacting and how much abundance there was in our forests, in our rivers, on our lands. And Peter's talking about 100 years later, what after that, another 100 years, how things are and not quite as good. We are still struggling, and I'm glad to see that more is being done to conserve our fish, to bring back the caribou, to manage the moose population so that we have food to eat and we can continue to practice our lifestyle. Peter was born in 1911. He is in California Village, a mile from my house out of Peninsula. He died in June 5th, 1993. His father was Nikolai. Nikolai's father was Alexei. Alexei's father was Fyodor. And his father was Katanauchen, who went to Fort Ross in California and came back and got that name, California, which is where that village name came from, Peter's name. And he didn't make it back to Kenai until about 1821. He'd been down in California for at least 10 years, I think. His mother was named Agrafina Chikalushin. She was Tolchina. Her brother, Simeon and Theodore Chikalushin. Their father was Peter Chikalushin. Peter's sister was Catherine Chikalushin, who married Gustavin Constantine, who then she went over to Lime Village, and that's Jennifer's family. She's part of that family, and Helen Dick, my language teacher here, that's her family as well. So she has a connection here to cook in with. And thank you for being here, Helen. What else to say about this? I guess that's about it. It starts out well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Catherine McNamara. Some of you may know who she is. She's a writer, she's a poet, she's a fabulous person, and I've been working with her about a year or so now. I don't know how long. I've seen her work. I've seen what she's done with some of Peter California's stories over the years and really admired and loved what she's done. And now I'm working with her and some others to develop some more of her work that she's done. She came to Kenai in 1984. She went to go talk to Peter California. She had seen some of his stories and she wanted to learn more about what do those stories mean and to see if she understood them correctly. He ended up spending over time back and forth about 4 years of questions and answers and interviews and communication with Peter Kalafonsky. And he shared the backstory of the stories that he's been sharing. He explained in English what his thinking was. They came up with new English translations, and she documented hundreds of pages of their conversations, which are fascinating. With the work that they did together, Peter said that he wanted to share the stories in 4 different specific cycles. So there is the collected writings of Peter Kalafonsky. It's those same stories, but in the way that Peter wanted them shared, in a different order. And the first volume that Catherine did were animal stories. Niña nadó. Animal stories. It was called From the First Beginning, when the animals were talking. And one of the things that Peter said is, Bek kutana chulani suktu. The stories lay a trail for us. There's the crow story. There's many other stories that tell the intellectual, cultural, and spiritual history of the Kenai. I think it was the late 90s. She published online. You can't find anything hard copies. Online as an Apple book, this first volume is okay. This is the second volume. It was, and I don't have the year right, but maybe it's 2019, it looks like. She came out with the second volume. This was on belief stories. So the second volume, the second cycle of stories, the way Peter wanted to share with the new translations, with the conversations with Peter. This is the third volume. This has not been produced yet. And so this is what I'm starting to work with her on. We have another brand new emerging Dena'ina linguist who's been actually working on both of the first 2 volumes with Catherine. He's going to linguistic school in Texas now. His name is Will Norton. And Catherine got Will interested somehow. I think they live both back on the East Coast, and he's a pretty amazing, talented young man. And we're enjoying the process of developing and publishing all 4 of these as we can get funding and this third one is, it's called Kotala Teldev Kita Kudunes Tech Delfni, which means from the time of law and regulation. This is about our Dena'ina laws. And I'm missing my note page. Okay. These are stories about law and regulation, like the first lawmaker is one of them. And it's going to be exciting. We had our own laws, we had our own regulations, our ways of doing things, and I look forward to sharing that with everybody in a new way, with more information from Peter, from his backstory of of what these stories meant. Okay, volume 4. Is the title of this presentation that I'm giving, Kobelfnin Punktes, from when things have been happening to the people. These are more modern stories. Peter said modern was basically things that have been happening in the last 2,000 years. So most of them are more recent than that, but behind this, you can't really see it, but is a stick calendar, Denina stick calendar. It's like a cribbage board. It's got 365 days on there, and 12 months. And it's like a cribbage board where you track the days. That was how we kept. Helen, my language teacher, and my sister, was adopted by her dad, Pete Bobby, have one in their family. I haven't seen it in person yet, but I know it's there. I guess you can switch. I am Kenai, I'm Salamana. We are one people. We're still figuring out how to do that, because we have been disconnected in some ways through land claims, through the things that have happened here. But we are one people, and so we're working together, as I mentioned, to rediscover, to reclaim, and to restore our culture and language. I think that's my last slide. Or we don't maybe anything. Thank you. Time for questions?
Yeah, I think we have time for a few questions.
Well, you mentioned when the, first I would like to say that I do a little bit of these stories, like I read Peter's Campfire People Stories with my students. I teach at Kenai Middle School. And it brings like amazing joy to my soul that the Kenai tribe is so tapped into our school specifically. And the students have like, it brings them alive. You know, when we talk about little things in class like fairies, and I do a little bit of Denina language in my classes. But you mentioned that the books, the volumes were first just an Apple book. Are there print volumes of any of them yet?
No, both the two are available on the computer, on the internet. If you just type in Peter Kalifornsky or Denai, you'll find them. You'll find them on the internet. They're beautiful. Catherine really did an amazing job of putting them together. But we are hoping to publish in paper all 4 of them eventually. So, yeah.
Sarah?
So I live in New Milton and knew Nick Lehman before he passed away. And of course, their family is big into Agripina's book. Would that be the same person that you mentioned?
So I knew Nick Lehman. He fished with my grandfather, Gary Mann. I know his son Lauren. Many of you probably know his son Lauren. I am related to Agripina directly, and everybody in that book pretty much, and probably everybody in the Nilchik. But I don't think I have an answer for your specific question. I'm sorry.
That's good.
Do you have an early date on when your calendar was first designed or whatever? It's interesting that it's 365 days, and if you have it divided as you do. I just wondered where that came from.
My guess is it probably goes back about 10,000 years.
Oh, good enough. What's that?
One of your early slides showed a picture of what could be Southern California with beach umbrellas and all that. I assume that was Kenai River scene.
It was fish. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's
That was
hard to
powerful
generalize, but
Kenai.
what's the Denina reaction to something like that? No, there was even a more.
No, it was the
Maybe
first
the
one.
first
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's disgusting. I mean, I'm so happy and proud that that our river can feed that many people. But that's not a good way to do it. Not that I'm against dip nets, that's good, dip nets are good. But when I was a kid, I used to see belugas coming in and out of the river all the time. And what beluga is gonna go? Yes.
Yeah, that first passage you read, I believe, Garrett Verbeek, who's here, found that, and it might have been published in the New York Times, and it was like some federal agent who was based here in the 1870s, but the article apparently was anonymous, unless Garrett perhaps figured out, but I don't know, the style and everything is so interesting. But when he mentioned those 7 lakes in this chain of 7 lakes, I do think that that place is this here in Soldotna, and there's a Sibana and Denina means head lake, and I can't figure out. But if there is a string of 7 lakes, I believe, maybe some folks here don't know exactly where I mean.
Is that in town or do you mean farther out?
No,
towards
Siska Ridge, Siska Lake is a Denina name. It's really lucky we have some Denina names from the early 50s and stuff through the Moose Range employees and stuff. So Siska is Big Ridge. And so probably that writer was, right here. It's really cool. And apparently he's anonymous. Garrett, do you know any more about that?
We haven't been able to find him. I asked Russ Vanderlux if that was perhaps a Devon Trout article, and I don't recall that he thinks so.
That would be amazing if that date were overlapping and it was even by Ivan Petrov. But it's really cool and articulate, and it came out 9 years or so after he was describing that experience. So
I think Kelly had a question.
You mentioned that you felt disconnected from the land companies. I'm curious about why.
Well, we have 2 tribes in Kenai. We have 2 village corporations. And, just going through that process divided us. And so it creates ongoing problems for our people for generations. When one of us is a shareholder of this company and then we're shareholders of that, we're part of this tribe, we're part of that tribe, we're one people. And so we're trying to get back.
I think Adam had a question in the back.
John, thank you so much. That was amazing to hear. I was excited to hear about sort of Catherine McNamara's work more and sort of more of a backstory for some of the stories coming about. And I was curious, as you're kind of learning more about the conversations that Peter and Catherine had about the backstory of the stories, has that caused any sort of like aha moments, or kind of caused you to rethink some of the stories or see them in a new light?
There were many ahas. I can't. They just keep happening and keep happening. But I've been looking at those first 2 volumes for quite a few years, and there's such a richness and depth, and that, like I say, the backstory is there, and you get so much more insight into the culture and languages.
Does she have audio recordings of her interviews with Peter?
No, he did not want to be recorded. So she was excellent at writing, and thus we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of conversation notes. I forgot to read one thing, so if it's okay, I'll read it. It's because my family is from Ski Lac Lake, the outlet of Ski Lac Lake. That's Udalin. The Student and Pena. Yes, Elacte. In the 19th century, it became known as Stepankas after the chief Orteshka. That's my great grandfather, Stepan Mishkov, and his father was also Chief Stepan Mishkov. The Skilactinaina are mentioned as organizers of the 1790s war on the Russians. And during the 1862 smallpox epidemic, the Skilac people requested vaccinations from the priest, Abbot Nicholas at Kenai, who sent the church song leader to inoculate the people. A month later, the song leader returned and reported vaccinating over 100 people. The Mishikovs, a father and son, both named Stepanka, were Keshka or chiefs of the Kenai Dena'ina in the 1800s. The elder Stepanka began to move his people to Kenai, building a native village near the Russian fort after a church was built in 1841. People began to spend more time near Kenai, but continued to live upriver for trapping, fishing. And that's from a nomination for a historic place for Stepanka. Thank you.
Our next speaker, we're going to move into the 20th century events and move south to Kachemak Bay. The next talk is the tanker Rebecca incident. Alaska comes of age and the royal state. And our speaker is Doug Bailey of Homer. And Doug engaged in oil exploration in Alaska before becoming a lawyer in 1965. He was district attorney in Anchorage in 1968 with principal responsibility for designing and conducting the state's legal case against the Rebecca and her captain. He was also Attorney General of Alaska at the time of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Turning it over.
Yes, it's a great honor for me this afternoon to speak with you folks about the tanker Rebecca incident, February 19th, 1968 in Kachemak Bay. I started working on this subject, this material, on February 19th, 1968, the day of the Rebecca incident. So I've been working on it for 55 years. And about 10 days ago, I got an email saying, you have your presentation ready in a such and such format. And I said to myself, no, I don't even know what that is. And I recognized that I needed help. So I went online and I responded, I said, I'm sorry, I don't have it in that format. And the next thing that happened, I had a message from Shannon, whom I had never met, and didn't know it all. And she said, Doug, I think I can help you with that problem. So if the report works, the text is mine, if the report and the exhibit work, you have to give Shannon great credit as a co-presenter. And if it doesn't work, then I'll take the responsibility. That stops here. But anyway, I just wanted to be able to express my appreciation.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have to say, Doug is my first new friend that I met through working on the conference.
And those should be shared maybe with all the volunteers. Made this event awesome. Anyhow, if we can have another picture there, please. This is a picture of or a map of the North Kenai. The events that we're going to talk about today, the key ones really occurred here as well as in Kachemak Bay. And if you know the area Swanson River Unit Number 1 is right down where's Swanson River. Lewis River, I think.
Keep going up.
Further, oh.
Much higher.
Keep going up.
We're almost, which will feature
Here we go.
in the story. The Kiski, which will feature in the story, is right there. And we're close by, we're right here. So this is, part of this is right here in our neighborhood. And in 19, we're gonna go back a little bit earlier than that. Let's try the next picture if we could, please. Going back, first of all, to one other note that I want to make, it just occurred to me during the last presentation. A subtitle of my story is Alaska Counts of Age as an Oil Producing State. And if I can take a little liberty, I'll give it a subtitle and say this is when things were happening to the people. When 1957 dawned, the oil industry in Alaska had drilled over 160 wildcat wells, none of which were successful, 160 some failure, but they had not given up. Territorial Governor Ernest Greening was one of the big promoters in developing hoping for an oil industry and for an oil discovery. He sort of stepped aside from his environmental position for a while and promoted the hope for discovery of oil because it would provide an economic base helpful in advancing his quest to attain statehood. And then in April of 1957, on Alaska's Kenai Peninsula, just about 12 miles north of the community of Sterling, Richfield Oil Company of California started drilling at its Swanson River Unit Number 1 project. Supervision of the project, known in the industry as sitting on the well, was responded to Richfield Oil Company's geologist Ray Arnett. Some wonderful stories about Ray Arnett, but that's another topic. The Swanson River Unit Number 1 is about 10 miles from this room where we are gathered today. On July 20th, 1957, Swanson River Unit Number 1 encountered oil in commercial quantities at a depth of about 11,000 feet below the surface. There's an interesting oil patch story that accompanies the selection of the drilling site for Swanson River Unit Number 1. Bill Bishop, who was at the time the chief geologist for Richfield Oil Company, after many weeks of field work on the Kenai, was said to have dug the middle of his boot into the ground and made a slight depression and said, "Drill here," and that is where the well drilled. The final development of Swanson River Unit Number 1 disclosed that Bill Bishop's heel mark was at the very edge of the field. Several other wells were drilled in the field, but it was determined after that was developed that had he been off a mere 100 yards further north, the structure would have been missed entirely, and we of course don't know what might have happened next. And I have this picture, which is on the screen, and people tend to say it's upside down, but in fact it's not. This is a picture that I took 3 days after the discovery of Swanson River Unit Number 1. It's a picture of the rig reflected in a pool of the first oil produced on the Kenai Peninsula, which was pumped into a depression scraped in the earth with a bulldozer, so they could prove the well, pump it a little bit, and find out what the production ability was. So, in some respects, that's the first oil spill. And I realized that there was an oil, there was petroleum activity in the Peninsula area 50 years before that, but that's beyond scope of what I want to discuss today. In any event, the well upon completion produced 900 barrels a day. And we will encounter Bill Bishop again in a couple of minutes. If I could have the next picture, please. I didn't have a picture. These are some pictures that Sean provided for me. These are Swanson River Unit number 1, and taken 2 years later, after the well was fully developed and ready to produce. Additional wells on the Kenai and in Cook Inlet, all within a couple of years. And within a few years of 1957, production is actually flowing via tankers loaded in Nikiski, which we pointed out. I think many of you are familiar with the location of Nikiski, and delivered from there to refineries on the west coast of the United States. And again, Nikiski is about 15 miles from where we are assembled in this room today. Now, en route to its ultimate consumers, petroleum, crude oil, performs what I refer to as its Midas magic. Because as it travels from where it's produced to where it's ultimately consumed, it for all practical purposes turns into gold. It provides great riches to the producers, great riches to the investors and stockholders of the company, great revenues to the government, and thousands of jobs, all of development that has so much changed this part of Alaska. So I consider this to be the most transfigurative change ever experienced in Alaska, which was soon to become an oil state. And on this topic, I commend to you John Strohmeyer's book, 1993 book, which he subtitles Big Oil and the Transformation of Alaska. And I offer today a brief report on a subset of this transformation, the Tanker Rebecca incident, February 18th, 1968. And after my presentation, I have a couple of exhibits back in the back of the room that you might want to take a look at that sort of fill in some of this story. The Tanker Rebecca incident was in Kachemak Bay, right off of Homer, within sight of Homer Spit, and just a few miles south of where we're gathered here today. Now we know all too well that a portion of the crude oil produced from any location escapes from its captivity. Fractured pipe, loose connection, accidental or intentional opening of a valve, overfilling of a container, can and does periodically reduce crude oil into the environment, where it transforms not into gold, but into toxic sludge, oil slicks, tar balls, hazardous toxic vapors, and the like. Cook Inlet waters in the Kenai were not then and are not now immune to those types of escapes. For example, if we can have a picture, I hope of it very much. The Homer News, these are just some examples of these clippings. They're all in the back if you're interested in looking at the ones that the Homer News for September 22nd of 1966 reported that the companies engaged in petroleum activities in Cook Inlet had been requested to comply with anti-pollution provisions of federal law, such as the Rivers and Harbors Act, and also reported that a recent inspection had discovered oil slicks leading from a number of vessels in Cook Inlet, and further that the Department of Fish and Game had been receiving reports that fishing interests in Kachemak Bay, Cook Inlet, had furnished evidence of oil contamination on fish and in their gear. And I expect, I haven't thought about it until immediately preceding presentation, that the indigenous people of this area were probably more seriously affected than many of us, because they relied more directly on some of the resources that were experiencing the oil spills. Another example. I can have the next report, I think it's on there. The Anchorage Times, January 12th, 1968. This just a couple of weeks before the Rebecca. Reported that Anchorage fisherman Stan Conway had lost 3,000 pounds of halibut, which he had caught off of Anchor Point and found to be covered with oil and therefore unusable. The same article reported that a Sylvania fisherman at about the same time had caught and reported 50 king crabs, similarly coated. So, well before the Rebecca, the Cook Inlet oil pollution problem had flowed also into the political arena. The Inlet Courier, Kachemak Bay edition for January 19th, 1968, reported a meeting of the Kenai Peninsula Borough Assembly, which addressed the issue of pollution locally. Bill Bishop, the same Bill Bishop of the famous Heel on the Ground at Swanson Unit number 1, appeared before the Assembly and told the Assembly, and I quote, "We're trying to resolve our problem," close quotes. And further he said, quote, "I'm getting gray hairs from all of this trouble with the ducks, the crab, and the halibut," close quote. Bishop promised to study the issue, and again quoting from the paper, he hoped to have an answer in a few days, close quote. Well, I think perhaps folks at Mr. Bishop was prescient. In fact, part of the answer, and a very big part of the answer, was very, very close at hand. But I don't think that it was the answer that Bill Bishop was expecting or looking. The issue hadn't been ignored politically. There have been efforts to address it by the Alaska State Legislature. Headline in the Anchorage Daily News for January 27th, 1968. I think we've already saw this article. Announced that state Senate committees are probing inlet and the Kachemak Bay oil pollution. Senator W.I. Bob Palmer of New along with Senators Jay Hammond, Senator Nick Begich, and others, were searching for legislative solutions to respond to the issue of this pollution. But it just seems that at the time, that concern had not become strong enough on a statewide basis to bring about passage of the bills that were being considered. The proposed legislation was opposed, surprisingly perhaps, by the oil industry. The Chichaco News for February 16, 1968, this is 3 days before the Rebecca, reported that Captain Charles Erickson of the American Anchor Ship Association had argued to a legislative committee that additional laws would not improve the pollution problem. So these articles indicate or illustrate the how the stage was set for the arrival of the Rebecca in Kachemak Bay on Sunday, February 19th. And on that day, probably a relatively quiet day on Kachemak Bay, middle of the winter, Captain Elmer Johnson, master of the 735-foot crude oil tanker Rebecca, after arriving in Cook Inlet from the Gulf of Alaska, turned his ship into Kachemak Bay, and thence to the pilot station, which then, as now, is located between Homer Spit and 60-foot Rock, which can easily be seen from the end of Homer Spit. And it's on the marine chart that I have in the back of the room, should you be interested in looking at it. Captain conned his ship up to the pilot station and took aboard the local pilot required for the passage up Cook Inlet to the loading platform at Nikiski, where he would take on a loading petroleum. The pilot ship at the time was the motorized sailing boat Altair. And Altair, now many years into retirement, presently rests in what I call the museum area of Homer Spit, where there are several wrecked and abandoned vessels. You can see out there on your next visit from Homer Spit, and perhaps be reminded of the events that I'm discussing with you here today. We can safely assume, I think, that Captain Johnson anticipated a routine and uneventful voyage. If you have the next picture, please. But there was at least a third vessel, Altair, Rebecca, and at least one other vessel that were transiting Kachemak Bay at that time. Crab fisherman Henry Gain of Seldovia. That's Henry on the left. He was piloting or transiting his little boat, 40-foot wooden boat, fishing boat, little two. This is a little two also. I think that's Henry Gain in the pilot station. And he was transiting from Seldovia into Homer, as the Rebecca picked up its pilot at the pilot station and was transiting Kachemak Bay from the Homer end out. And being of sound judgment, Henry decided that he would cut behind Rebecca and not in front of Rebecca, size being a major factor in marine piloting, I have found. So he passed behind Rebecca and through its wake. And as he passed the wake of Rebecca, he noticed an oil slick widening behind her stern. Henry stopped his boat. He could have gone on, could have just gone on about his business, but he didn't. He scooped up samples of an oily mass from the surface of the water into mason jars. And he reported his findings and observations by radio to Jim Reardon, the area biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and Homer. If we could have the next, I think we have Jim Reardon. Many of you may have known Jim. For years, he was the area biologist, and then also became an author, wrote several books on mainly with Alaska historical motifs, including such Alaskan subjects as Alaska's Wolfman and Kastner's Cutthroats, a saga of the Alaska Scouts and their involvement in the Aleutian campaign in World War II. So he meet again with Henry Gain, who I'm happy to say became a very good friend of mine because of my involvement with him in the Rebecca incident and frequent companion during my visits to Homer until his death 2 years ago. Now, I'd like to say about Henry Gain, as I said, he could have gone on and done nothing, but he didn't. He did the right thing. He stopped and he performed a service to Alaska, which I think we should all give him our thanks. And I thank you, Henry Gain, for making the time out of your busy day and out of your business to report the incident and take steps to advance the cause. Henry also, as a result of my involvement in the Rebecca incident, became a good friend of many years until his death. And when I would see him, he would be coming back from king crab fishing in Kachemak Bay. If he'd see me out in my boat, he'd always pull alongside and throw 4 or 5 king crabs onto the deck. Way more than I could ever eat. I used to cook them and walk around the deck, around the dock and Seldovia and give some of them away. But anyway, Henry reported to Jim Reardon, and within minutes, Reardon chartered an airplane from Homer Air Service, flew over Rebecca, where he reported and observed and reported and photographed a 200 to 300 foot wide oil slick originating from the tanker and extending 12 miles astern. However, Jim did not, and he could not, from his vantage point, report the particular section of the vessel from which the discharge originated. Reardon reported his observation as soon as he got back to Homer, to his boss, Augie Reitz, the commissioner of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in Juneau. who in turn promptly arranged the meeting with Attorney General Edgar Paul Boyko and Governor Walter A. Hickel. And for those of you that may recall Governor Hickel was no stranger to bold and rapid decisions, sometimes perhaps without quite enough careful deliberation. You may recall the saga of the Alaska State Ferry Wickersham. Again, that's a story for another time. Hickel got the report, and he immediately entered an order and directive to his people. The Alaska State Troopers will seize the tanker Rebecca and will arrest her captain when the tanker arrives at the loading dock at McKissick. Just a few minutes after that meeting, I received a phone call at my home in Anchorage. It was my boss, Attorney General Boyko. I was at the time the state district attorney for South Central Alaska. General Boyko briefed me on the Rebecca incident, told me to be in contact and deal with Jim Reardon, and directed me to prepare a criminal complaint and an arrest warrant for the captain of the Rebecca and papers allowing the troopers to seize this vessel. General Boyko provided me with no legal advice as to how to configure those documents. And I went right to the office and try another picture here. That's it. I found when I got to the office, and this was a Sunday, I called in one of my assistants, Mark Rowland, who is now a retired judge, lives in Seldovia, in the presence in Kachemak Bay. And drafting this criminal complaint proved not to be as simple as I assumed it would be when I got the instructions with no details. We got out the criminal code and we started our research. We researched oil pollution, we researched oil spill, and we researched tankers, and we researched clean water, and we researched pollution. We found nothing. Finally, we found the Alaska statute 1165-010. There's the fact you should remember. Defining the offense of discharging ballast into the navigable waters. Close quote. But the question, so it sounded like we had something that was at least in the ballpark. The question was this oil slick ballast? Because there are several different sources potentially of oil from the tanker. It can be fuel oil, pumpers, it can be lubricating oil, cooking oil for the galley stove. Was it ballast? That was a difficult decision. And I immediately made the decision it was ballast. And the reason was that if it was ballast, we had a statute. And if it wasn't ballast, I'll let the lawyers in the room decide whether I took an undue liberty. And I did prepare an arrest warrant, criminal charge and arrest warrant for John Doe, the master of the vessel Rebecca. Now, the legal basis for the seizure warrant proved even more elusive. And I will admit to a measure of legal imagination and originality, I did produce a seizure warrant for the vessel Rebecca. And General Boyko later on, in one of his press conferences concerning the incident, said that he believed this to be the first time that the state of Alaska had ever seized a tanker. And he believed, in fact, it was probably the first time that any state in the Union had ever seized a tanker. And I did have a sigh of relief later that Sunday night. I turned the papers over to the troopers who were waiting in my office when I learned that both the arrest warrant and the seizure warrant had been approved and issued by Magistrate Jess Nicholas in Kenai late that evening. And so, when Rebecca arrived in McKissick at 3 a.m. the next morning, Monday morning, a detachment of state troopers under Major William Trapton and Lieutenant William Nix boarded the vessel and seized her. Her master, then identified as Captain Elmer Johnson, was arrested. He was placed in handcuffs and he was booked into the Kenai jail. Now, I would like to be able to report, I could go on and on about this incident, and I'll spare you a lot of it. I would certainly like to be able to report that Alaska and I won a stunning legal battle against the captain and against Rebecca. But the answer is we did not. Over the course of appeals and there's the current headline. Thank you. And the next one, I think. There's the Rebecca at the dock after she was seized by the troopers. And the next one, Cooper sees big ship on oil pollution charge. But anyway, we had a flurry of hearings in Kenai and in Anchorage before a couple of different judges in Anchorage over the next 3 or 4 days. And the courts essentially rejected all of the arguments which I had fashioned. Captain Johnson was discharged. He went free. He regained his ship. He loaded a cargo of petroleum aboard Rebecca and sailed south. And what we learned, though, the great lesson and takeaway from that was that Alaska at the time had essentially no legal prohibitions whatsoever against this type of conduct. I did not miss a statute. I easily could have, but nobody ever came to me later on and said, "Gee, Doug, if you'd have just gone to the next page and done this, you'd have found this." There was nothing, and there was nothing that authorized us to expressly to seize the vessel. But that wasn't quite the end of it. Within days, new bills started arriving in the Alaska legislature. It was February, the legislature was in session. And bills addressing this problem started to find their way in. Senator Palmer's bill that I had mentioned earlier, Bob Palmer, senator from this area, started to move. Other legislators that were particularly active in promoting the passage of new legislation included Clem Tillian of Halibut Cove, Bob Palmer, who I have mentioned, Clem Tillian, Jay Hammond of Salmon Rich and Bristol Bay, Lowell Thomas Jr. of Anchorage, and Senator Begich, our United States representative, promoted the legislation along with many others. At this time, because of Rebecca, it got a lot of tailwind, and within a couple of weeks, Governor Hickel was signing legislation, and Alaska's first oil spill legislation came in to existence. So my argument is that prior to Rebecca, Alaska had gladly accepted the benefits of the oil industry. We had gladly accepted the tax revenues that flowed to the state. We had gladly accepted the jobs and the overall development generated by a developing oil industry. Rebecca was, I contend, the incident that awakened Alaskans to the necessity of taking responsible steps to protect the people and resources from the risks, the downside risks, which accompanied this development. We cannot just accept the benefits, we have to accept both sides. I hope that we have done an adequate job of that. It's a continuing trend. So in conclusion, I contend that on February 19th, 1968, Alaska came of age as an oil producing state. And so the date, February 19th, 1968, don't forget. Thank you.
We're running a bit behind now, so I would suggest if you have questions for Doug that in the upcoming break, you can talk to him and look at his scrapbook.
Thank you.
So our last talk is shifting baselines and response to ecological change in Ketchikan Bay, Alaska, by Marilyn Sigmund. Marilyn is a former director of the Center for Alaskan Coastal Studies in Homer and marine education specialist for the University of Alaska Fairbanks Alaska Sea Grant Program. She's also the author of the book Entangled: People and Ecological Change in Alaska's Ketchikan Bay.
I know we might run a little bit into the break, so I understand if someone needs to.
We got a little bit late.
Okay, yeah, okay.
And Marilyn, when you're speaking, if you could just face the front as much as possible, because the folks online are having a hard time.
Okay, I will do that. So I'd like to acknowledge that the place I'll be speaking about are lands and waters within the traditional territories, the Dena'ina and the Secwepemc. And I apologize that I haven't learned the plan name for the group that was in Ketchikan Bay of the Dena'ina. I have to learn that. I'd also like to acknowledge that their oral histories contain stories about the relationships with other animals that take place in what they refer to as time immemorial. And John mentioned some of those stories about animals that don't have a time period assigned to them. This is my first time at a Alaska Historical Society conference, and I think my talk might be a little different from the ones you've heard so far. But I think the talks, the film that we saw at noon and the talks by Adam and John really go in depth into what I'm going to really paint in more broad strokes about the relationship of people with two other species, particular species, over a long period of time, and not only as food, but for other uses and perceptions about the relationship between people and those animals. So there's a lot of in-depth information presented even about plants at noon, and a lot about, that John had much about the Dena'ina and the salmon, of course, from Adam. I really want to talk more about how I ended up approaching the writing of an environmental history of Ketchikan Bay, which was motivated by a search for lessons from the past about coping with and adapting to environmental change on the scale of what we're experiencing now with global warming. What we're experiencing is not global warming, which is warmer sometimes and really hot. What's changing is our relationships to with the ecological consequences of global warming. That's what's affecting our relationship to other species in our food webs. So this is the question that I was kind of pursuing as I dove into the past. I first thought I was writing a natural history, but I realized that the story I wanted to tell was driven as much by cultural dynamics over time, if not more so, than by ecological dynamics. So they were just absolutely entangled, which became the title of my book. And so this question I was trying to answer for myself, sorry, I won't turn that way, but also for how to, give some opportunity for my readers to think about things in that way for their own home places if it was beyond Ketchikan Bay. What can we learn from the past that will help us cope and respond to climate change in our home places? So, and I personally was feeling a lot of loss, and we call it, eco grief, about how things were changing around me. So it was kind of directed more at the psychological impact of climate change and how that sometimes makes it very difficult to respond and adapt. So the scope of this story in Ketchikan Bay is more than 8,000 years that we have archaeological evidence for that people either lived in the bay or at least passed through it and left something behind. I'm sure most, if not all of you historians, would have told me this was impossible, not even to attempt this task. And I certainly heard that from a number of ecologists, marine ecologists. But yes, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll say next. I'm just surprised at it. Okay, thank you. Many of you are likely familiar with this timeline of the human occupation of Ketchikan Bay, or the similar pattern in the central Kenai Peninsula that where riverine cultures prevailed instead of marine ones until about 1000 AD, when the Dena'ina expanded into the central and lower Kenai Peninsula around the same time. So for more than 1,000 years, both areas had year-round settlements and seasonal camps of a cultural group whose toolkit was similar across a broad region within that white triangle that you see on the slide. on the left. So the archaeologists designated it a tradition, as they did for these toolkits that were over large geographic areas at the same time. And they named it the Catchmack tradition, as was the convention for naming it where the place was first excavated by, in this case, Frederica de Laguna in Catchmack Bay. But the marine and riverine lifeways of the group were very different, especially when it came to salmon fishing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The marine Catchmack tradition ended 400 to 500 years earlier than the riverine one, and quite a bit earlier than the marine one on Kodiak Island area. So this event, this cultural change that happened, which was abrupt by archaeological standards, which means over a couple hundred years, not like on one day, was kind of this mystery that persisted in the archaeological literature for decades, trying to figure out what was the causative factor or factors that precipitated this disappearance of the Catchmack tradition from Catchmack Bay. I placed a large green arrow at the time of contact to emphasize that the major cultural shifts and transitions that followed contact were accompanied by a major shift in the scale of human impacts on marine and terrestrial ecosystems in and around this region and Alaska in general. So before contact, there were hunter-gatherer groups who harvested locally and traded regionally when they had surpluses. But after contact, harvesting within the region was on an industrial scale that supported the international trade of large quantities of fish and wildlife products. Everything was commodified, like furs and canned salmon. And I just want to point out, I kind of ended the Dena'ina occupation of Catchmack Bay sometime after contact. It was not an abrupt one. It can't really, I don't know, there's a date certain or a year certain. It's just that as the settlement pattern was continued north of Catchmack Bay sometime after contact, and very few Dena'ina people remained in Catchmack Bay. I think there were just 2 informants that Osgood could find to learn about that Dena'ina cultural practices in that area. So as I plunged into this research process, I found an overwhelming amount of very disparate historical information. Some of the resources that were mentioned earlier, and as Adam mentioned, I looked at those, but I also looked at scientific journal articles and what is, I think, still think is kind of a peculiar separation we have between the natural sciences and the social sciences. They look at things very differently. And also some of the accounts, especially of the early naturalists and the government reports that they wrote. And so just a lot of different things. And so some of the histories that people in this room wrote about this area. So I looked at all of that, and it was, I said, very disparate, hard to reconcile, hard to pin down what really happened. But I had a lot of those, what in the world was I thinking moments when I came close to giving up on this whole idea. But what I wanted to share with you today are 2 concepts or themes that helped me figure out how I might best approach the question I had posed in a nonfiction way, because that was my intent, to write a nonfiction book, not a novel. Next, please. So the first big idea that developed into kind of a golden thread through all of this information about the human past in Catchmack Bay, and which helped situate myself within it, was that of shifting baselines, which emerged in natural resource management in a paper that the fisheries scientist Daniel Pauly published in a scientific journal in 1995. He began by describing the way that fisheries scientists and managers tended to dismiss statements by older fishermen that the fish were much, much bigger in the past, and also much, much more plentiful. And sometimes they had the pictures to prove it. But the scientist side of things dismissed it as anecdotes and didn't give it the same validity they would to data that was collected by scientific methods. Pauly coined this term, shifting baselines, not as a ecological phenomenon that actually existed out in nature, but a psychological phenomenon that caused fisheries managers to misjudge the actual rate and magnitude of change in fish populations. So I'm going to read a short passage from my book, which summarizes what he said in that paper. Next, please. Next point. Oh, I'm sorry. You go back one. Okay. I guess I put it in my notes instead of putting it up on as a slide. Okay. Pauly chided fisheries managers for failing to identify the correct baseline for the size of a population under natural, quote unquote, conditions, which he defined as before people began harvesting that particular population or exploiting it as a resource. The baseline that managers begin with, Pauly suggested, is a personal one based on the state of the world in fisheries at the start of their careers. But if no one pays attention to historical data, if it even exists, and they pay attention only to populations of fish after they've already begun being exploited, he thought it was possible to make a terrible mistake. The fisheries managers, in fact, will reset the baseline at a much lower level than it once was. This matters, Polly said, because long but slow declines of fish populations would never be detected. This was a widespread kind of thing going on in fisheries management at the time. Polly declared it was a syndrome, but what's lost in the process, he concluded, was that when every generation redefines what's natural or normal for a population is an accurate perception of change. So I realized that this syndrome would apply also by extension to wildlife management and to our perception of what are healthy, productive ecosystems in places versus ones that we perceive as where the diversity and abundance to be declining. And there are lots of implications that flow from that view that I kind of delved into over the course of my writing. But I thought it was all interesting that he was speaking from within Western science knowledge system that keeps extensive records and has rigorous methods for passing collective knowledge down over generations. And so I did, on one side, on one hand, it helps us kind of understand why people have such a hard time paying attention to environmental change that's happening slowly. You know, the proverbial frog in the pot of water that's heating up slowly. And it really kind of matters when the frog or ourselves jumped into the pot and started paying attention that things were changing. But there's also the consideration that the indigenous cultures in Alaska and elsewhere have a very different system for passing down ecological knowledge about particular places over many generations, as we've heard up to date for the Dena'ina. But what was especially relevant to writing about environmental / cultural history was that this time bias and time-bound feature of our perceptions of change would affect how we interpret and might be more likely to fail to learn from history. But on the other hand, it raises the stakes of the value of studying the past and writing histories as you do, as you all well know, but particularly the ones that kind of are trying to dispel this ecological amnesia that many people have about the places they are inhabiting and the fish and wildlife populations that we are exploiting. And this application that Polly made to this phenomenon to fisheries management provided me then with an approach I eventually took to reflect on human history through a series of stories or histories about the shifting relationships between humans and particular species of fish and wildlife, plus a few marine invertebrates that have been important beach foods in catchment Bay for at least 3,000 years. This proved to be a way to tie together the ecological and the cultural, because human perceptions about scarcity or abundance of these particular species and whether or not people were responsible for causing declines or for sustaining abundance was a fundamental aspect of the cultural shifts that happened. Next, please. The second way in which I began thinking differently about people and ecological change required that I go beyond my usual way of thinking about ecological relationships solely in the food web kind of way that I relied on for most of my career in fish and wildlife management and environmental science education about Alaska ecosystems. Now, this is something I just noticed a few years ago, but if you Google, food web and any type of ecosystem like the boreal forest or marine ecosystem or the Arctic, 90% of those images that will come back, you choose images, won't have a human in them. So the concept that kind of has been perpetuated in science and education is that food webs are everything but humans. And when you do find, next please, this is an Arctic food web that includes a human, who's a subsistence hunter. The way that those humans are portrayed is at kind of the top of the food web, an omnivorous consumer in ecology speak, like some of the other top of the food web animals, and having sort of having relationships with species at different levels in that food web. But we're shown kind of as that's how we influence and affect food webs. Well, that leaves a lot out of the picture about the role of humans in ecosystems. While we are similar to other consumers, we strive to find food to survive and perhaps store a little bit of fat in dynamic conditions. Our role in terms of our total impact on abundance of particular species and the diversity in the food webs is not at all the same in nature or magnitude as that of a bear, for example, which is also an omnivorous consumer. I had to expand my mental model to encompass a much larger role of humans as a change agent of food webs dynamics. Because we not only remove individual animals and a large biomass of selected species from ecosystems for food, we make use of animals and animal parts and have historically in many other ways in our technologies and also ways, next please, that lie in the realm of human wants and desires for things like luxurious puffin skin parkas or sea otter fur coats, baleen corset stays, glossy bird feathers to adorn ladies' hats, and Alaska salmon steaks that might be served up in expensive restaurants in New York City. Next, please. So here's another brief passage from the book where I describe what I call a greater ecology that encompasses human needs and desires. We are entangled with wild animals by our many uses of them, some of them not even tangible. It's a greater ecology constructed by human desires that have always coexisted with our need to fill our bellies. In the greater ecology of desire, the earliest people to live in Kachemak Bay killed not only for food, but for clothing and shelter, to make tools or to have something to trade, to make art. The greater ecology also involves luxury, prestige, and wealth. Today, we kill animals for science, for money, and our desire for what money can buy. So, and I might just mention it, in addition to our direct impacts on food webs, we are now affecting them indirectly by altering the composition of the atmosphere. So that's not even, depicted in food webs at all, except if we say, what are the effects of climate change on X species of the food web, and is it or is it not human caused? That's a whole different discussion than just looking at food web dynamics often. So next, please. This is a pretty simple schematic I came up with just to illustrate that green arrow effect, that there's this sort of impact, circle of impact, or quantified amount of impact that's related to meeting survival needs and satisfying wants at the local level. But when contact and industrialization of the use of those fish and wildlife resources expanded that impact on the diversity and abundance in ecosystems. And Adam mentioned keystone-ness, and I could talk for another hour about keystone-ness and humans, but I won't do that, I don't have time. We also, what we have that animals, no other species have, next please. We have this capacity to use increasingly efficient technologies to compete with all the other species in that food web. And it's sometimes neglected when we say we have to, we're competing, wolves are competing with us for the same species. And I don't think it's a real fair competition sometimes. But anyway, that's a total aside. So this is, and one thing I will mention when you mentioned that, look at this slide, I really appreciate that we got to see that movie at noon, because there's sort of this historical arc that you can trace, that the direction that is more and more impact because we've gone from local to global trade. But these local food systems are a good example to say this is not irreversible. We can ratchet back our distribution systems and our community trading and networks so that we're having, we're growing and harvesting locally food and trading among one another, which cuts out a lot of fossil fuel emissions from transportation, that sort of thing. So this is a part of the resilience in the system, is this ability to learn from this, the impacts of what has happened, and try to think of ways to ratchet back that process. So next, please. So these are the lenses of shifting baselines in the greater ecology of human desire that I use to frame and connect histories that focused on the shifts for humans and particular species. In one section of the book, I focused on the Kachemak tradition, which had this wealth of zoological information because the remains of many animals were preserved in their garbage piles or middens, and they were shell middens, so they were preserved very well. And there were some great, very quantitative studies that could be done by zooarchaeologists to try to figure out how the relationships, at least proportionally, had changed over time. And that yielded some really interesting information. And the Dena'ina, on the other hand, pre-contact Dena'ina sites, I think throughout, I think I can generalize beyond Kachemak Bay, they really didn't leave anything behind in their house sites and settlements. And that the story then for me became trying to understand the meaning of the absence of bones, shells, and cultural artifacts. And so that required understanding some more qualitative rather than quantitative aspects of the Dena'ina relationships to different species. And like Peter Kalifornsky and Danita Peters, among the few remaining speakers of the Dena'ina language at the time, collaborated with the linguists, including Alan Boras and James Carey, to share the spiritual and ethical beliefs that were the foundation of these cultural practices with respect to the dead and disposal of things away from the house sites. Another section of the book focuses on the history of the American commercial fisheries that began in and near Kachmak Bay in 1882 for salmon and 1911 for herring and halibut. And it's a similar story to the one that Bridget Broke told yesterday about the salmon fishery development in Bristol Bay, in that there was an unregulated kind of what I call chasing abundance that happened. And it took a while before the regulatory folks caught up with that unregulated slaughter would be when they put it, which is that not any, it was basically for profit and there was no concern about sustainability. And then the story of people and sea otters was kind of a through story all the way through the time that people were in Kachmak Bay, with the exception of the short period when they had been extirpated by the fur trade and returned about 60 years later. So that I kind of used that to bookend these other two sections, because there was a pretty recent study to combine traditional knowledge and an ecological study of what subsistence foods in Port Gramman and Wallach that focused on a chitin called the Bidarki, and that turned out to actually be a story about what happened after the return of the sea otters, and the people and otters were occupying both were occupying traditional territories, but they were competing for these beach foods. So this is a long story with lots of twists, very complex, and even into, of course, the present, when there's continuing Marine Mammal Protection Act allows continued harvest, but only for handicrafts, and it's a very complex story. But I think it really illustrates all these cultural shifts, how they feed into ecological shifts and vice versa. So next, please. So this is that same timeline that I've kind of placed where these stories fit, these histories fit. But I would say, just because there isn't a species in a box in a timeline does not mean that people did not have a relationship with those species. This is where the most quantitative, information comes from, out of things like the zoological studies and after contact, the cases of salmon packed and all those kinds of things. And I just say one couple things about why, you see halibut where halibut bones were in the middens, and marine fish were really an important part of their diet. But there were just a handful of salmon bones ever in Kachmak tradition middens, and no herring bones. And so anthropologists who look at that said, well, that doesn't mean they didn't harvest salmon, although the salmon streams in Kachmak Bay are very short and they're not huge runs of fish like further north. They might have gone somewhere to fish and left just bones there. And herring bones are tiny, and the methods they might have used to screen through the material might have just missed them. Next, please. So, you know what, let's get, I have a kind of long story about the end of the Kachmak tradition and what I think is the solution, but I'm gonna talk to me later or read the book. Next, please.
The whole next one.
Next. Okay. All right, and this is the punchline of that story, is that the evidence that was collected, all the zoological studies kind of just came with they couldn't really find any environmental evidence that there had been a big change. And yet it seemed like the diet was deteriorating. It was getting very narrow at the end of the last couple hundred years. They were eating a lot of halibut, a lot of clams, and not as much seal and harbor porpoise meat as they used to. And the zooarchaeologist, which David Yesner was one of the prominent ones who wrote the paper about it, said, aha, we now have evidence that these people overharvested their resources. And that was actually had not been documented. It appeared in the literature of Pacific Northwest cultures, or anyone along the Pacific coast from California to the Aleutians, and there was a paradigm with, wait, this is just uniformly rich area. It's a stable environment. There's no, how could people overharvest? Why, this didn't seem like why would they stay there for 200 years and just overharvest in one area? And why would they even have a scarcity of food? But then the different scientists tried to correlate other things going on in the environment later with this end of the Katmai tradition. Volcanologists, the seismologists, and the glaciologists. And what the glaciologists came up with, next please, was that there were glacial advances happening from the Kenai Mountains into Katmai Bay, and they pinpointed it to 545 AD from the tree ring data. But there was even later than that, the ice cores in Antarctica had ash layers that were connected with massive volcanic eruptions from Iceland volcanoes, and they happened in 536, 540, and 547 AD. And a journalist from the Science magazine, interviewed a medieval historian when this data came out. And Michael McCormick was his name, not the Anchorage Michael McCormick. And he said, oh yes, he said 563 AD was 536 AD was the worst year ever to be alive on the planet, because there was historical information about the skies being darkened for 18 months in a row, the year with no summer, crop failures, and famine widespread across Europe and China. So I think there's pretty good evidence this was a cold period, that certainly these volcanic eruptions just notched it up a bit, pulled it even further. And even though it's possible that the Katmai did overharvest and food was getting harder to find as it got colder, that's the other explanation. And that was kind of like the structure of the camel's back when it had this very cold period. And there are other accounts in the oral histories that have been transcribed, like for the people of Hawarik, that also mention a year with no summer as one of the disasters that they remember, but they of course aren't dated. And some people are kind of trying to connect that statement with these volcanic eruptions. So I'm just gonna say three things about are a little bit about resilience. I already mentioned the resilience that is coming out of local food systems and local trading and cutting out some of the supply chain carbon emissions that are helping to cause global warming. I think that the resilience I saw over this whole history was in these indigenous cultures that have been sustained despite, all the really tragic consequences of colonialism and the territorial era. They sustain these cultures with moral obligations to sustain the abundance that they are connected with in other species. And the other place that had to be legislated, but is also in our culture, is this conservation movement that eventually, got ahead of unregulation and focusing only on profit and letting those interests control the politics of our country. And we're able to pass and enforce legislation to regulate harvest, preserve habitat, and hopefully now can do, maybe that's the only way we need to go in terms of other things that will help us adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change.